Before we step into our next mystery, I invite you to join our growing circle of observers. If these stories of the unknown have captured your imagination, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. By doing so, you help ensure that these forgotten fragments of history are never truly lost to time. Turn on your notifications to be alerted whenever a new shadow is cast. Now, let us return to the darkness. The ghost signal of the Orang Medan, the ship of the dead. The Strait of Malacca is one of the busiest waterways in the world, a narrow neck of ocean where the heat is heavy and the mist never truly clears. In June of 1947, the air was still and the sea was a flat, glassy mirror. But this peace was shattered by a frantic, jagged distress signal picked up by British and Dutch listening posts. The Morse code was frantic, stumbling over itself. The message was simple and terrifying. It claimed that the captain and every officer on the SS Orang Medan were dead, sprawled in the chart room and on the bridge. There was a long, hollow silence, followed by more disjointed clicking. Then came the final chilling words, "I die." When the rescue ship, the Silver Star, finally pulled alongside the drifting freighter, they saw no movement on the decks. There were no faces at the portholes, no response to their whistles. As the boarding party stepped onto the metal deck, they were hit by a coldness that shouldn't have existed in the tropical heat. What they found was a nightmare frozen in time. Every member of the crew was dead, but they had not died peacefully. They were scattered across the deck, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide and bulging as if they were staring at a horror that had descended from the sky. Their arms were outstretched, fingers clawing at the air, warding off an invisible enemy that left no mark and spilled no blood. Even the ship's dog, a small terrier, was found on the deck, its body arched and its teeth bared in a silent, permanent snarl. The rescuers noted something even more inexplicable. Although the sun was blazing at nearly 100 degrees, the air inside the ship felt like a tomb. There were no wounds on the bodies, no signs of poisoning, and no evidence of a struggle. It was as if their souls had been sucked out of their bodies in a single, terrifying heartbeat. As the crew of the Silver Star prepared to tow the ghost ship to port, a thick, sulfurous smoke began to rise from the cargo hold. They barely escaped back to their own ship before the Orang Medan was torn apart by a massive explosion, sinking into the abyss and taking its secrets into the deep. To this day, the story of the Orang Medan remains one of the ocean's most guarded secrets. Some suggest a leak of potassium cyanide or nerve gas, while others believe a pocket of methane gas rose from the sea floor to suffocate the men. But science cannot explain the look of pure, unadulterated terror on the faces of the dead, nor why the ship felt like a frozen wasteland in the middle of a tropical summer. As you drift into sleep, listen to the low hum of the distance. Somewhere out there, the Orang Medan still drifts in the darkness of the sea floor, a silent witness to a horror that the living were never meant to see. The Vanishing of Roanoke. The colony. That time forgot. History is written by the survivors, they say. But what happens when there is no one left to tell the story? When an entire settlement, men, women, and children, simply evaporates into the salt air, leaving behind nothing but questions that have echoed for nearly 5 centuries? Before the Mayflower ever sighted land, before the high-masted ships of the 1600s claimed the coast for the crown, there was an island off the shores of what we now call North Carolina. It was intended to be a beacon of English permanence in a strange new world. Instead, it became a tomb without bodies. Today, we step back into the shifting fog of 1587. We look for the ghosts of the lost colony of Roanoke. The story begins with a man named John White. He was an artist and a map maker, a man who saw the beauty in the New World. But more importantly, he was a grandfather. Shortly after landing on the marshy banks of Roanoke, his daughter Eleanor gave birth to a girl named Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born on American soil, a symbol of the colony's future. For a few brief weeks, there was celebration. There was the sound of a crying infant amidst the towering pines. But that future was bleeding out from the start. The settlers arrived too late in the season to plant crops. The soil was sandy and stubborn. The local tribes, understandably wary after previous bloody encounters with English soldiers who had come before White, were not inclined to help. They watched from the tree line, silent and invisible. Supplies were dwindling, the salt beef was rotting, and the fresh water was brackish. Desperation turned into a cold, hard reality. The colonists begged White to return to England to gather the food, tools, and reinforcements they needed to survive the coming winter. White was torn. He didn't want to leave his daughter and his newborn granddaughter in such a fragile state, but he had no choice. As he boarded the ship, the last thing he saw was the small cluster of wooden cabins growing smaller on the horizon, the smoke from their meager fires rising into a vast, uncaring sky. He promised to return in months. He had no way of knowing he would never see any of them again. When White reached England, the world was on fire. The Spanish Armada was coming. Queen Elizabeth I seized every available vessel for the war effort. Not a single ship was allowed to leave English waters. For 3 long, agonizing years, White was a prisoner of geography. He paced the docks of London and Bristol, looking west toward the Atlantic, listening to the waves crash against the English cliffs. He knew that every day he was delayed, the chances of finding his family alive were evaporating. He knew they were likely eating bark to survive, or worse, succumbing to the fever that haunted the swampy coast. Finally, in August of 1590, 3 years to the day after he had originally departed, John White returned. The heat of the Carolina summer was heavy and stifling. As his ship anchored in the region known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic, the sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the dunes and the maritime forests. He ordered his men to fire their cannons, the thunderous booms echoing off the trees to signal their arrival. He waited for a shout, a wave, a single plume of smoke from a cooking fire. There was only silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy in the ears. The landing party rode through the surf under the cover of a rising moon. As they walked toward the settlement, they found the grass waist-high and overgrown. The paths were reclaimed by the thick brush and the twisted vines of the island. When they reached the clearing where the houses once stood, they found a scene that defies logic to this day. The houses weren't burned down. There were no signs of a desperate battle, no broken arrows embedded in the wood, no scorched earth or scattered belongings. In fact, the houses weren't there at all. The entire settlement had been systematically dismantled. It wasn't destroyed, it was moved. It was as if the 115 colonists had decided to leave, packed their lives into crates, took the very boards of their homes, and walked into the sea. White found his own chests of books and maps, which he had buried before leaving. They had been dug up and torn apart, his life's work rotting in the damp soil. And then he found the only clues they left behind. Carved into a heavy wooden post of the fort's entrance, about 5 feet off the ground, was a single word as capital letters, Croatoan. Nearby, on a tree trunk stripped of its bark, were 3 letters, C-R-O. Years earlier, White and the colonists had agreed on a secret code. If they were forced to leave the island under duress or attack, they were to carve a Maltese cross above their destination. White searched every inch of those wooden posts, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood in the dark, desperate to find the mark of a cross. There was no cross. To White, this was a sign of hope. It meant they had moved 50 miles south to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras, to live among the friendly tribe led by Manteo. But the sea is a cruel master. A massive storm began to brew. The ship's anchors were slipping, the provisions were low, and the sailors, terrified of the treacherous shoals, refused to go further. They forced White to abandon the search and return to England. He died years later, a broken man, haunted by the image of that empty clearing. So, where did they go? The mystery only deepens as the centuries pass. In the late 1930s, a series of mysterious stones were discovered across the southeast, known as the Dare Stones. They were covered in intricate, frantic carvings, allegedly written by Eleanor Dare herself. They told a harrowing story of disease, the death of her husband and child at the hands of savages, and a desperate trek into the deep interior of the continent. While many historians dismiss them as elaborate hoaxes, the stones speak to the very real psychological horror the colonists must have faced, alone in a land that did not want them. Then there are the oral histories of the local tribes. For decades after the disappearance, European travelers reported seeing gray-eyed natives among the tribes further inland, people who possessed English features, light hair, and knew words of a language they shouldn't have known. There are stories of a tribe that claimed their ancestors could talk in a book, a clear reference to reading and writing. But there are darker, more ethereal legends too. The legend of the White Doe tells of a ghostly deer said to be the spirit of Virginia Dare, forever roaming the forests where the colony once stood, protected by the woods themselves, a silent witness to the vanishing. Did they integrate and fade into the bloodlines of the New World, becoming part of the very land they sought to conquer? Or did something more sinister, something ancient and deep within the American wilderness, claim them before they could reach safety? Even today, in the age of satellites and ground-penetrating radar, the answers remain buried beneath layers of sand and time. Every few years, a shard of 16th century pottery or a rusted hilt of an English sword is found in the dirt, a fleeting, cold heartbeat from a dead civilization. These artifacts don't give answers, they only deepen the silence. Roanoke remains a scar on the map and a permanent chill in the air of the Outer Banks. It is a reminder that even in our quest to conquer and name the world, the shadows have a way of reclaiming what we leave behind. The next time you stand on a lonely shore at night, listen to the wind as it whistles through the pines. It might just be the trees whispering that same 6-letter word, Croatoan. The Empty Light. The Tragedy of Eilean Moor. There is a specific heavy kind of loneliness that belongs only to the sea. For those who man the lighthouses on the jagged edges of the world, silence isn't just a condition, it's a constant companion. But in December of 1900, On a cluster of remote, uninhabited rocks off the coast of Scotland known as the Flannan Isles, that silence became something much more sinister. The lighthouse on Oileán Moor was a brand new sentinel, built to guide ships through the treacherous, foam-flecked waters of the Outer Hebrides. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering, standing tall against the Atlantic's fury. It was manned by 3 experienced, hardened keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their job was simple, vital, and absolute. Keep the light burning no matter what. But on the night of December 15th, a passing steamer called the Archtor noticed something impossible. The horizon was a void. The great lens of the Flannan light, usually visible for 20 miles across the dark waves, was dead. Because of the fierce winter gales that define the North Atlantic, it took 11 days for a relief ship, the Hesperus, to reach the island. As the ship drew near, Captain James Harvey fired a signal rocket into the gray sky and blew the steam whistle, the sound echoing off the black cliffs. He expected to see the lighthouse flag raised. He expected to see the keepers coming down the steep stone steps to the landing. No one came. The island was as still as a tombstone. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who was meant to take his shift on the island, was the first to step onto the damp, slippery stone. He climbed the 160 steep, winding stairs cut into the cliffside, his heart hammering against his ribs in time with the crashing surf. He called out their names into the cold wind. He shouted until his voice was raw, nothing but the cry of the gulls. When he reached the top and opened the heavy door to the lighthouse, he found a scene that felt frozen in time. The kitchen table was set for a meal of salted beef and potatoes, a meal that had never been finished. A chair lay overturned on the stone floor, as if someone had stood up in a violent, panicked hurry. The kitchen clock had stopped, its pendulum hanging motionless. But it was the lighthouse logbook that turned a disappearance into a haunting. The entries, written by Thomas Marshall, described a storm of biblical proportions, a storm that supposedly began on December 12th. He wrote of winds such as I have never seen in 20 years. He claimed that James Ducat, a veteran seaman known for his nerves of steel, was quiet and morose. Most strangely, he wrote that the third man, Donald MacArthur, a man notorious as a tough, brawling back islander, was sitting in a corner, crying. But here is where the shadows deepen. On those specific dates, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th of December, the official weather reports from the nearby coast of Lewis were perfectly clear. There were no storms. The sea was recorded as calm. The final entry, scrawled on December 15th, simply read, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." The light had gone out the very night. When Moore and the investigators searched the rest of the island, they found signs of incredible, almost supernatural violence. At the western landing, iron railings that had been bolted deep into the rock were twisted like wire. A massive concrete block, weighing over a ton, had been ripped from its moorings. A crate of supplies had been smashed to splinters, not at sea level, but 110 feet above the water. The official theory was that a rogue wave, a mountain of water taller than the cliffs themselves, had swept the men away while they were trying to secure a crane. But that theory leaves behind holes that cannot be filled. Why were the heavy, oilskin waterproof coats of 2 men still hanging in the hall? Why would an experienced professional keeper like MacArthur run out into a winter gale in his shirt sleeves, leaving his protection behind? In the world of lighthouse keepers, leaving the light unmanned and going out without gear is a cardinal sin. It only happens in a state of absolute blind terror. The locals on the mainland had their own ideas. They spoke of the Seven Hunters, the ancient name for the Flannan Isles. They believed the islands were a thin place where the veil between our world and something much older was frayed. They whispered of the phantom birdmen, giant winged spirits said to guard the ruins of a small chapel on the island. Legends said that if you stepped on the island without praying, the hunters would take your soul. Others suggested a more human horror: island madness. The isolation, the pressure of the silence, and the howling wind can snap a man's mind. Did one of the keepers turn on the others? Did a secret resentment boil over into a murder-suicide, leaving one man to throw his comrades into the churning surf before he himself succumbed to the Atlantic? But no bodies were ever found. No blood was ever scrubbed from the stone. No clues ever surfaced to tell us why 3 men who had spent their lives at sea would simply vanish from a fortress of stone and glass. Today, the Flannan light is automated. No human being lives on that lonely rock anymore. The lamps are lit by sensors and circuits, far away from the reach of madness or rogue waves. But sailors passing the islands on a moonless night still keep their eyes fixed on that beam of light. They cross themselves as they pass the 7 hunters. They know that somewhere beneath those churning gray waves, 3 men are still out there, perhaps still waiting for a storm that history says never happened. The next time you see a light flickering on a distant shore, remember the 3 keepers of Eilean Moor. Remember that the ocean doesn't just take what it wants. Sometimes it leaves the table set, the clock stopped, and a mystery that will never be solved.